We're going to start. So welcome everyone. My name's Mark Hallett. I'm the Director of Studies here at the Paul Mellon Centre. I'm really pleased to welcome you all here on what should be a really lovely evening and the beginnings of what I'm very sure will be a very exciting event over the next day or so. And this is an event that in many ways is a culmination of lots of conversations that have taken place between my colleagues here at the Paul Mellon Centre, especially of course Sarah Turner, who's been so involved in helping organise this workshop or symposium with Ella Fleming from this side, but also with colleagues at the Henry Moore, especially, I guess, Sebastiano, Godfrey, and others who have been really central to thinking about this event. And this event in itself is a result of a growing collaboration between our two institutions. The Paul Mellon Centre, over the last few years in particular, has really started focusing as much on 20th century and modern British art as it has traditionally on 18th and 19th century British art. That's something that we've really been excited to be doing in partnership with a number of different institutions and colleagues. And we've also really wanted to make sure that our focus is not only on painting or on, but also on sculpture and other kinds of visual materials. And so over our last few years, we've organised events on a whole range of different kinds of materials. But sculpture occupies a special place in our concerns, partly, of course, because Sarah herself has been so interested in sculpture in terms of her own studies and research, but also because we feel it's such an exciting field, right through the history of British art, but especially in the 20th century. So working closely with the Henry Moore Foundation and with the Henry Moore Institute, it seemed an increasingly great idea. And over the last year or so, we've been having more and more conversations together. And in many ways, this is the first great collaborative event between us, and we hope it will very much be the first of many. So on that note, I'd like to welcome you once again to this event. We're very, very excited and privileged to have this wonderful speaker, Tony, with us tonight. But also, I think Godfrey from the Henry Moore Foundation wants to say a couple of words too. So thanks very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Mark. And yeah, just to reiterate some of those important points. As you all know, I think the Henry Moore Foundation is really, really committed and devoted to the study of sculpture as one of our primary objectives. And with the interest in British art here, I think the coming together of our interests, and particularly Sarah at the nexus of that, I think is a really exciting time. And I hope that partnerships will increasingly define the Henry Moore Foundation's future in the way that Mark's described this organisation. So becoming Henry Moore is the origin of these conversations and this event. I do need to make an apology on behalf of Sebastiano Barassi. He's absolutely mortified not to be with us this evening or tomorrow, and Sebastiano is the absolute author of the exhibition Becoming Henry Moore, and it's something he's thought about and worked on for a long time. Unfortunately, he's racked with a terrible, terrible back pain, and his doctor's forbidden him to join us for either day, and he's very, very sad, but he was determined. I passed on his apologies. More about Becoming Henry Moore tomorrow, I hope, but it did make me think with this event that Becoming Henry Moore really has at the heart of its focus what was going on in Moore's life in the 1920s. But just for a while, if you'll permit me, if we roll forward about half a century, the same Henry Moore, who by then obviously had become Henry Moore, the Henry Moore the world knew, was very busy in his 70s, having really important conversations, one with his family, his wife Irena and daughter Mary, as they were working to devise the Henry Moore Foundation that we all came to know, and also popping back up to his native county of Yorkshire to meet with an eager young Peter Murray to talk about Peter's brilliant idea for turning the estates around Bretton Hall into a sculpture park. And I think Henry Moore enthused about both those things with his usual energy. Now, today, this year, both those institutions are enjoying their 40th birthdays. And I think it's fair to say, over the years, both of them have really achieved things that I hope Henry Moore might have dreamt about. But one of the great things, and fantastic that Tony is joining us and giving us his thoughts in this area this evening, is that at the moment, the most wonderful show of Tony's work is on show at the Yorkshire Sculpture Park, a project that I'm very delighted to say Lisa and my other colleagues on our grants committee were delighted to support with as much gusto as the foundation could manage. And so I think those things, the amazing show by an internationally acclaimed artist that is benefiting from those conversations that Moore had with people those decades ago. So that's a very exciting culmination. And then lastly, tomorrow, I know not quite everyone, but lots of you will be joining us in Peregrine tomorrow. The show, I can't praise highly enough. Sebastiano has really pulled together with his team the most amazing gathering of objects that inspired Moore and fed his creative energy. I'll save some more of that for tomorrow, but thank you very much, Mark, Sarah, for your collaboration. Thank you to my own colleagues in Peregrine and Leeds for supporting this. And I now hand over to Sarah Turner to say a few words of introduction. Thank you.
Well, I don't want to turn this into an Oscar night of speeches, but I just do want to briefly make a few connections between tonight's paper and the event tomorrow. And we've been discussing between our institutions and our colleagues, thinking about how we might shape a research event connected to this exhibition, discussing becoming Henry Moore. And I think many of the papers tomorrow will think about Moore's formation as a sculptor, his influences, his pedagogic formation at art school, the influence of his cohort and his generation on him. So tonight we wanted to do something a little bit different and kind of go beyond those chronological confines of Moore's early career and his formation, and think about his legacy and his impact on other sculptors and the histories of sculpture in the 20th century. And so we were really delighted that Tony Cragg accepted our invitation to really grapple with that long shadow that Moore has cast over the history of sculpture in the 20th century, and really think about Moore's impact in terms of environment, materialities, and those legacies of form which shape so many discussions and histories of sculpture. Tony Cragg will not need an introduction to many people in this room, but let me just give a very brief one. He's exhibited internationally since 1969. He currently lives and works in Wuppertal in Germany. He's held professorships and fellowships around the world. He's represented Britain at the Venice Biennale, won the Turner Prize, and, as Godfrey said, has an amazing exhibition at the Yorkshire Sculpture Park at the moment, Tony Cragg, a rare category of objects, which I'm sure many of you have already visited or will be on buses and trains to Yorkshire to see soon. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Tony Cragg.
So, thank you very much for the introduction, ladies and gentlemen. Of course, appearing in front of a bunch of experts on art history and Henry Moore in particular is a little bit of a daunting project for me, so I won't even pretend to act like an art historian insofar, but I will insofar talk about the history, of course. I thought what all I can offer you is to say how I've seen and thought about Henry Moore in the course of my own life. And so, every school child growing up in Britain in the 1950s and 60s knew who Henry Moore was. In fact, I would say that with little hesitation that everybody in Great Britain knew who Henry Moore was. At that time, Britain was struggling to recover in the aftermath of the Second World War and was coping with the ramifications of the loss of the British Empire and diminished economic power and influence. At such times, individual human achievements, such as the first ascent of Mount Everest by the New Zealander Eben Hillary and Sherpa Tenzing Norgay in 1953, and the breaking of the 4-minute mile by Roger Bannister offered an inspiration and lent support to the belief in mankind's ability to overcome its limitations and confront whatever challenges we are confronted with. Whether understood and appreciated or not, Henry Moore's fame as a sculptor who made new figurative sculptures that were renowned and exhibited all over the world was a significant feature of that time, and for many a source of national pride. The first time I can remember seeing a Henry Moore sculpture was on an outing with my primary school from Welwyn Garden City to the London museums that included then the only Tate. I think it was probably in 1958, and I was 9 years old at the time, and Henry Moore would have been 60 years of age. Looking back on that occasion, one thing now seems to me to be of great significance. I had already heard the manner in which my parents and other grown-ups talked about Henry Moore's work, and I had often heard jokes and seen cartoons of women with tiny heads, with tiny staring heads and holes in their abdomens, and therefore I knew that his work, and modern art in general, was controversial, criticized by some, and derided by others. But in the eyes of a child, the museum, as museums were and continue to be today for children today, was only full of unexplainable and exciting new images and things. From Expressionism through to Cubism, Futurism, Surrealism, with works from Van Gogh, Gauguin, Braque, Picasso, Matisse and Dali, as well as Henry Moore and the other artists of his generation, offered only wonder and delight. We may have liked certain things and disliked others, but we accepted it for what it was, the experience of something new, modern art, free from the historical awareness, ideologies and prejudices. And thus started my history of art, even if I have to admit that the visits that were scheduled for the afternoon to the natural history and the science museums quickly took over my schoolboy fantasies and excitement. As we all know, Henry Moore grew up in a small mining town of Castleford, Yorkshire. He had the good fortune to have strong independent parents who, despite his father's low coal miner's income, provided him with a stable and caring family environment and the encouragement needed, as they did for all their children, to do what they could do to improve their station in life by hard work and education. There was also a historical sequence of individuals, from school teachers and collectors of modern art and later on figures of significant standing in the art world, who recognized in Moore a young artist of great talent and potential. From a very early age, Moore showed an artistic sensibility, a discerning eye, the necessary ability and the determination to express himself in a material form. Perhaps, and especially with regard to what was to come, the clear hallmarks of an obsession that, if historical accounts are to be believed, found its defining moment when Henry Moore discovered the work of Michelangelo and the epithet, the greatest sculptor that ever lived. There is, of course, a great deal of social romanticism attached to the British tradition of talented and determined individuals who fight their way out of a working class background to become successful. Their motivations are easy to grasp, and they simply have to have exceptional individual abilities in order to make the grade in a society where others are privileged to have the real systemic advantages of financial support, family social position, collective interests, and cultural backgrounds that nurture the expectation and assumption of success. Many artists, musicians, and writers, including D.H. Lawrence to the Beatles, have risen to world renown from this background, so much so that it sometimes appears to be a stereotype, and even to some extent as a justification for the acceptance of an unjust social reality. There is, of course, a temptation to cast Henry Moore in the mold of the working class hero that he justifiably is for some. But what I am drawn to when considering Moore's childhood and background is less the social context, but the materiality of his surroundings, his visual, haptic, and spatial qualities. The tight and close spaces of the red brick houses he grew up in, sharing a small bedroom with his siblings, the smell of the coal fire that heated the house for the larger part of the year, waking up to Jack Frost on the window panes in the winter mornings, the stone floors, the washing line billowing in the yard on a dry day, visits from friends and neighbors, his father's boots and working clothes, along with his violin and tools, and the all-pervading coal dust. The uniform rows of houses and the cobblestone streets where Moore used to play with the other children in the neighborhood and the clatter of horse and cart that, despite the increase of motorized vehicles, still predominated at the time. During the week, there were groups of men either on their way to work or coming back after long shifts in the mine or pottery industry, up at the crack of dawn to help his mother tend the stove and do other jobs around the home before getting off to school. At the weekends, there was the occasional get-together and the obligatory attendance of church on Sundays. A tight-knit society in which both joy and suffering were unavoidably shared and felt by all, and in which Henry Moore acquired the humanity that was to accompany him all his life and become the central source of his work. At the same time, and in near proximity to all this intimacy and closeness, there was, and still is, an open landscape of meadows enclosed with hedges and dry stone walls, bits of forest that stretch along the valley of the River Aire that runs through Castleford. Slightly further to the west, the landscape rises and falls with increasing magnitude until one arrives on the edges of the wild and dramatic Yorkshire moors that crown the Pennine Way. Moore loved the landscape and all that could be found in it, and one could hardly imagine a greater contrast between the material qualities of his home situation and the open spaces of the Yorkshire landscape. He had grown up in a culture where manual work was the main, if not the only way to earn a living, and he knew what hard work entailed. He obviously realized at a young age what many others and most artists come to realize, that what you create is in all regards a real extension of oneself in the world. And I think it is fair to say that in Henry Moore's case, he decided, probably at a very young age, that his extension into material was not just limited to 3 dimensions, but was always intended to extend well beyond the duration of his own lifetime, posterity. Moore, who survived the First World War as a soldier in the infantry and was later commissioned to document the consequences of war for the civil population during the Second World War, had been a witness to the atrocious conflicts of the modern world. His work developed at the same time that Bertrand Russell, Herbert Reed, T.S. Eliot, and Auden were influential in the intellectual life of Britain, often dealing with themes and issues of human existence in modern society. His response to that tumultuous and at times catastrophic period in history was to create figurative sculptures that seem apart from all chaotic evolution and divorced from the struggles of everyday existence. From 1959 to 1962, at a time that Henry Moore was at the pinnacle of his world acclaim, and making his large, roughly contoured sculpture reclining figure that is installed at the Lincoln Center in New York, I attended a boarding school in Little Haddam in Hertfordshire. Haddam Hall was the school, was less than 3 miles away from Much Haddam and Perry Green, where Henry Moore, unbeknown to me, lived and worked. And as I was very keen on cross-country running, what we call jogging today, I must have passed very close to his studio many times. Haddam Hall was on a farm and specialized in science subjects, and at that time I was much more interested in things such as physics, biology, and geology than art. Those years, and indeed the rest of my teens, up to the end of the 60s, was a period, as some of us may remember, of immense social and cultural changes. Pop music and pop art attracted the attention of a dissatisfied and rebellious youth who had more or less lost faith and respect in their parents' generation and sought to change and reform society. In school, we were introduced to the works of the leading culture figures of the time. In addition to Auden, Eliot, and Russell, there was Robert Graves, Sylvia Plath, Ted Hughes, D.H. Lawrence, Benjamin Britten, Paul Nash, Francis Bacon, Ben Nicholson, Graham Southern, and a generation of sculptors that included Barbara Hepworth and Henry Moore. Maybe we're just too young to appreciate them then. I certainly do now. But the tenor of their work, for all their humanitarianism, seemed dark and austere, and even at times a little pompous. They had, of course, just been through a world war, in some cases too, and were all in their way actively contributing to rebuilding British society. To many young people, however, they represented the establishment, and this view of things also included Henry Moore, who was often seen as the willing flagship of British culture and dispatched to all corners of the earth. My own interest in making things began in earnest around 1968, while I was working as a laboratory assistant and had started to draw more or less just to pass the time, an activity that rapidly and completely absorbed me and led me to my decision to go to art school. During my foundation year at the Gloucestershire College of Art in Cheltenham, I was obliged halfway through the second term to take part on a sculpture course. And although I was unprepared for the task, I was almost instantly amazed at how rich an experience it was. Just moving the material and creating new forms, volumes, silhouettes, changed instantly what I was thinking and how I felt. I experienced how changing the form of the materials with my hands literally changed my mind. I had neither specialist knowledge nor had I any traditional sculpture making skills, and the materials I had to hand were simple industrial materials that were not intended to make art with. All the same, I was hooked. I continued my studies at the Wimbledon School of Art and was taught by Roger Ackling and Jim Rogers, both of whom had studied at St Martin's School of Art and who afforded me an insight into the broader issues of art in Britain at that time. I believe that becoming involved with sculpture in Britain at the end of the 1960s and into the early 70s was one of the most fortuitous coincidences in my life, and something that I regard even today as a privilege. Henry Moore was 70 at that time, and he and Barbara Hepworth were undeniably the most eminent sculptors in Britain, but by no means the only ones. There were other members, roughly of their generation, who shared an interest in making anthropomorphic sculptures, of whom Kenneth Armitage and Glyn Chadwick were the most interesting. Edoardo Palazzi was also an important artist that took a solitary position. And then there was a large and vocal, one could say belligerent generation of sculptors who made mainly non-figurative metal constructions that consisted of industrial metal elements that were welded together to make three-dimensional compositions. This group was led by Anthony Caro and Philip King and included William Tucker, Tim Scott and Isaac Witkin. Their work was inspired by the work of the American sculptor David Smith. They definitely saw themselves as being the new avant-garde and as a challenge to Moore's position and attitudes. But this loosely defined movement was in turn quickly challenged by the work of a new generation of sculptors, whose work was radically new and based on concepts and ideas about the material world in general, and were not focused on the traditions of sculpture and sculptural representation. These sculptors included Barry Flanagan, Richard Long, Gilbert and George, Bruce MacLean, and John Latham. The discussions about the purpose, content, and form of sculpture were fierce, uncompromising, and invariably self-justifying. Henry Moore himself was by that time already so established and successful that he did not personally or directly get involved in these conflicts. But it was definitely his work and his overwhelming success that provided an impulse and stimulus to the interest in sculpture and this historical conflagration of sculptors in Britain. In addition to this national scene, there were a large number of international movements that played a role in developments in Britain. Pop art, of which the British Independent Group was a progenitor, had produced a number of sculptors like Claes Oldenburg, George Segal, and Ed Kienholz, and was still very influential at the end of the 60s. New art movements like Fluxus, Arti Pauvre, land art, minimal art, body art, and conceptual art were all introduced into Britain within the space of a few years. And there were, of course, a number of more singular sculptors of tremendous interest whose work had become well known. Amongst them were Edoardo Palazzi, Jean Dubuffet, Jean Tinguely, John Chamberlain, Jean Miro, Joseph Beuys, Alexander Calder, and Alberto Giacometti, and there were many others. And in fact, many other countries, such as Germany, Spain, Italy, and the USA, for example, were equally active centers for sculpture activity. Put all together, this was the cosmos of sculpture that I encountered as a 20-year-old, in which Henry Moore was a bright but distant star. It was going to take me many years to understand and order what on the surface looks like an enormous number of different styles, formal solutions, and personal obsessions. As a young sculptor, the last thing I wanted to do was to look at the works of the past. My idea of making sculpture was to make things with the materials I found and learn in that process what I could do with it and what that could mean to me. I rarely tried to copy or make representations of other things, whether from nature or from history, from industry. On the contrary, I wanted to make things that were entities in their own right. This attitude was, of course, contemporary to that time, so I automatically tended toward the work of the younger generation of artists, and this tendency became more concrete when, through my friendship with Roger Ackling, I made the acquaintance of Richard Long and several other artists of that generation. My approach to sculpture making was indeed essentially very different from Henry Moore's, who eagerly, almost obsessively, sought out and studied what he regarded as the great sculptures of history, starting with Michelangelo, but going back through the ages to Mexican and Greek art and beyond in a search for archetypal forms. Moore's expressed mission was to make great sculpture, and he consciously used art history as a source of inspiration, and obviously he was very successful in his quest. He looked at and considered everything that offered him a new idea or a new form in which the human figure could be represented. His ambition to make great sculpture for the world, what he called major sculpture, made it an obligation for him to study all the possibilities. He obviously regarded different cultures, movements, styles, and even different artists' work, past or present, as being useful examples of how sculpture can be made. It was an approach that was difficult to emulate by the generations that followed him, partly because he had done it so well, and one could only end up being a follower or a competitor of Henry Moore, something that Anthony Caro and others certainly understood and what had forced them to move on. And partly because the main focus for sculptors no longer lay with the notion of an archetypal or ideal form, but in the discovery of new forms and new content, and invariably used new materials to achieve that. In the minds of many people, sculpture is associated with material effigies, frozen in time, statues, static and unchanging. Nothing could be further from the truth. Sculpture has evolved in a dynamic and even dramatic manner in the course of the 20th century. One only has to consider the fact that in the 19th century, sculpture in Europe was all based on relatively anatomically accurate representations of the human figure. And at the beginning of the 19th century, when all the other art forms were producing some of the greatest paintings, music, and literature the world has ever seen, sculptors produced nothing of the same importance. Due to the fact that the European academies of the time controlled and the distribution of commissions, they also controlled the financial means that are so essential for sculpture making, due to the fact that sculptors need materials, space, time, and energy to be able to make their work. This restrictive practice resulted in sculpture being reduced to a repertoire of formal metaphors and cliches. In the course of the 19th century, sculptors such as Medardo Rosso, Aristide Maillol, and Auguste Rodin, for very different reasons, led sculpture away from anatomical imitation. Rosso's work echoed the interests of the Impressionist painters, who responded to the consequence of the discovery of the microcosm and the realization that the surfaces of things are only an impression or function of our perceptions. Rosso's work is often hailed as the first modern sculptor. He created surface that can be read in the same way we look at each other, reading the surface textures, subtle forms, and substructures. Maillol's simplified and geometrized figures made no attempt to make a virtue out of anatomical detail, and introduced the composition of geometric forms as a form of expression. We can also see in his work the influence of sculpture from other continents and cultures such as India, Africa, America, and Asia, and he is often cited as a possible precursor for Henry Moore's work. And Rodin made highly emotional figures that pushed the human figure beyond the limits of anatomy in order to create expressive and dramatic forms. He was influenced by Nietzsche, Rilke, and Sigmund Freud's description of the role of the conscious and unconscious and deeper emotional roots of the human psyche. In doing so, he breathed new life into figurative sculpture and widened its scope of expression. But at the same time, he was putting new demands on the material, expecting it almost to quiver and vibrate with emotion. He also marked the limitations of the classic figurative tradition. These essentially 19th century sculptors were followed by Constantin Brancusi, who found inspiration in the carving tradition of his homeland, Romania, in the strongly expressive sculptures from sources outside of Europe, and the simplified, tight, and precise forms of the industrial, technological products at the beginning of the 20th century. He, and sculptures such as Eric Gill, Dobson, Guardi-Bresca, and Epstein, provided a direct link from the 19th century to the work of Henry Moore. There were two other very significant and revolutionary new developments in sculpture at the beginning of the 20th century. The first was the creation of structural sculptures that completely did without figurative representation. Inspired by the industrial structures of the time, works like Tatlin's Monument to the Third Internationale stripped sculpture of the last vestiges of human anatomy and qualities, except for the existential strength that any structure must possess in order to overcome gravity's constant efforts to steal our vital energy and reabsorb us. This was the beginning of a tradition of constructive sculpture that exploits the expressive power of structural compositions. The second radical department of sculpture in the 20th century was the introduction of the ready-made by Marcel Duchamp. By exhibiting industrially made objects and artifacts as artworks, he began a process that during the course of the 20th century enabled artists to use every available material and object to make art with. This new technique for making sculpture depends essentially on the understanding of the fundamental relationship between material things and the language associated to them. The underlying principle being that while materials and objects exist physically as three-dimensional extensions in space and time, they also exist in another form, in our minds. What one could call the metaphysical existence of things. The images, properties, words, and terms we store about everything we perceive is the basis of thought and language. All terms and words are forged from material reality. We do not just consume parts of the material around us to build our physical bodies, we also consume the world around us to form our minds. Artists discovered that it was possible to change, even completely transform objects without ever having to touch them. by changing or adding to the terms that were associated to that object. As we are all well aware, this approach to making art has grown considerably in power and influence in its application and importance during the 20th century. So what I'm trying to describe is the fact that by 1920 there were three fundamentally different approaches to making sculpture. Firstly, the traditional methods of carving or modeling that had for a long time been based on the figure and uses a relatively limited range of appropriate craftsman's materials, and even form today the popular notion of sculpture as a skill and a craft. The direct carving movement, of which Moore was such an important exponent, was a result of this ethos. The second approach was to construct sculptural structures, invariably using suitably rigid materials. And the third method states that all materials and objects, whether from nature or man-made, can be used to make art with and be carriers of emotional content and express artistic ideas. It has often been said that the most influential artist of the first half of the 20th century was Pablo Picasso, and that Marcel Duchamp was the major influence in the second half. It is certainly true that many of the art movements after the Second World War and up to the present were based on the use of the ready-made methodology introduced by Marcel Duchamp. It is the sum of these three approaches that has made sculpture into an art form that today expresses relationship and gives meaning to the entire material world. Sculpture today is, in essence, the discipline that concerns itself with how materials and material forms affect us. In doing so, it touches on major concerns with regard to content and values, and therefore, not surprisingly, engenders at times heated debate about its form, function, and direction. The post-war period, not just in Britain but in many other countries, can be understood as the moment in which these three different sculptural methods clashed, and that with interesting and sometimes dramatic results. The themes of the ensuing conflict were inevitably in part formal, but much more than that, they were ethical, moral, social, and political in nature. One should never make the mistake of believing that sculpture and art in general are just about making pleasing or interesting things. Aesthetic values are always the expression of one's deeper existential values, priorities, and needs. Anybody doubting that only has to consider with what vehemence and even aggression people react to artworks in public spaces. Henry Moore was the epitome of a modern sculptor, highly regarded by some and highly criticized, even ridiculed by others. Known by people interested in art and to the man on the street, he became a household name and helped a nation find its identity and humanity after the trauma of a nation that had had to fight in 2 world wars and was in the process of great transformation. He showed great courage and resolve in not just overcoming the initial reaction to his work from parts of the public and press, but he was also subject to great pressure from institutions and persons within the art world who frankly tried to destroy his career and reputation. Looking back, I'm also aware that the possibility of being able to contribute to or participate in the major conflicts and debates in and around 1970 did in part fuel my own interest and enthusiasm for making sculpture. Art is, of course, a form of self-expression, but even more than that, it provides a way for individuals to extend themselves in space and time, and one could say spiritually, beyond the framework of their social backgrounds and origins. Most artists, Henry Moore and myself included, have come to understand that well. In 1973, I started my studies at the Royal College of Art, where Henry Moore and Barbara Hepworth and others of their generation had studied 50 years before me. South Kensington was for me, as for them, and for the others, before a fantastic place to study. When Moore was once asked about his inspiration, he answered, "Inspiration? I don't really need it. I have Picasso in the British Museum." What a seemingly disarming honest reply. I cannot imagine many artists today having the humility to state their sources so clearly, and in doing so, to reveal one's overriding ambition, namely simply to make great sculpture. It also displays a candor that only very self-confident individuals possess. Without knowing at the time how Henry Moore had pursued his studies, I was automatically drawn to the natural history and geology museums, with which the Royal College of Art Sculpture Department shared a backyard. I was soon allowed to enter both museums through the back door. Although Moore did not mention these museums, I feel that it was inevitable that he also spent a great deal of his time in both of these museums, especially the Geological Museum, that at that time had the most beautiful displays of rocks, minerals, fossils, and landscapes, to which I must sadly add that they have been destroyed and replaced today by gaudy Disney-type didactic displays. Moore's visceral response to nature and material forms becomes very clear in his own statements, such as the following. In Yorkshire, in Addlewood, just outside Leeds, there was a big rock, amongst many that I've called Addle Rock. That influenced me quite a bit. For me, it was the first big, bleak, powerful form, very impressive. It was the local beauty spot, so to speak, and I knew it from a child. And much later, when I was a student, I would visit it with friends. We would picnic and draw and play around. It was an exciting place for me, Addlewoods. During my own studies, I continued to make work using the industrial discarded building materials, furniture, and household goods that I could find in the area around me, and made sculpture that at times drew a parallel between natural forms like geological structures and man-made forms like stacks. In this way, I was reacting to a certain fascination with simple and smooth forms of minimal art that seemed to me to be so perfect and resolved, but which at the same time displayed a cold-hearted, arrogant, even slightly fascist industrial inhumanity. In 1977, I moved to Wuppertal in Germany, where I have lived and worked ever since. In the late 70s and into the 80s, I had plenty of opportunities to exhibit my work, and I spent much of my time traveling, looking for materials and subject matter for which I made works for the places I exhibit in. For me, it was a time of great adventure, in which I learned a great deal that informs and feeds into my work, even up to the present day. And I must add that it was also the most exhausting of times, and I increasingly became aware of the necessity to change my practice and return to making sculptures in the studio. In 1983, having just finished installing my work in a gallery in Toronto, I decided to visit the local art gallery of Ontario. Unsuspectingly, I entered into a large concrete gallery to the left of the entry hall, where more than 25 Henry Moore sculptures, plaster sculptures, were exhibited. This group of sculptures were a gift from Henry Moore to the AGO and consist of the original plaster works from which many of his best-known works had been cast in bronze. I needed a moment to decide whether to enter or not. After all, it was only Henry Moore. But the nearest of the sculptures seemed at least difficult to decipher from the doorway, and I stepped into the world of Henry Moore. And he immediately embraced me. I became engaged by these energetically carved sculptures and the vivid marks left by their shaping. A precise range of tools had left their marks, sometimes as subtle, erosive agents, and sometimes as a clear vocabulary of expressive gestures equivalent to brushstrokes. What was remarkable was that despite that there was an apparent looseness or naturalness to the markings, they never relinquished their willful control over the form. Sculptural volumes result out of the composition of planes, surfaces, their contours and their edges, lines, investing themselves on the visible periphery of the material. An edge flowed out onto a plane, and the plane gradually pulled itself into a point. It is Moore's masterful control of these sculptural volumes, contours and lines, that is the essence of his genius. The experience of looking at this group of sculpture leaves the observer in absolutely no doubt that he is in the presence of a superior sculptural intelligence. This may seem obvious, as saying Mozart was musical, but it was definitely for me an important experience to be able to look at Moore's work without the usual accompanying awareness of the historical importance of this iconic sculptor. If only because Moore's plaster sculptures in Toronto are whitish, calcareous, and roughly hewn like the limestone outcrops, so typical of the Yorkshire moors, they reveal the direct relationship between his work and the landscape he grew up in. A harsh landscape, full of beauty, austere and serene, with farms sheltered in its dales, and its wind-swept heights are home only to the hardiest of creatures. The only figures that can survive in that landscape do not need to sustain flesh and bone. They are themselves wrought and hewn from archaic materials and reside in time. They could be pagan, early Christian, aliens or figures of the future. Time becomes irrelevant because they are an amalgam of all those possibilities and their destination is eternity. It is striking how this almost unbearable level of vision stands in stark contrast to the mundane physicality of the small red brick terrace houses of a small coal mining town. This is the force field of influences that provided Moore with a slingshot ambition to use material to project ideals well and beyond that of a moribund industrial reality. Far from being only formal sculptures, a criticism sometimes made of Moore's work, his figures transport the values and morals that Moore saw as being eternal and relevant to all human beings. They provided a physical support to the humanitarian ideals of the time, and they were an attempt to give modern man back his dignity after having been embroiled in the inhumanity of war and his subjugation in a harsh industrial society. The female form, the crux of all human existence, it assumes a predominant role in Moore's work. Matter, mother, the source of our nativity, a homeland, the lap in which we repose, a landscape, our provider and sustenance. Moore's women are strong and independent, and perhaps can be understood best in his own words. Without consciously setting out to do that, they've turned out that way, matriarchal women, merely because that's the basis of my own upbringing and relationship to my mother. She was to me the absolute stability, the rock, the whole thing in life that one knew was there for one's protection. If she went out, I'd be terrified she wouldn't return. So it's not surprising that the women have had this kind of feeling, that the women of the kind of women I've done in sculpture are mature rather than young. Moore's contribution to art does not lie in the introduction of new materials into the realm of sculpture. He uses the traditional materials of sculpture, and in doing so, allows himself to be compared to a long tradition of sculpture making. His motif is the human figure, and time is a factor. His work reminds us that for whatever reason we are here, and however long human beings exist, the form, shape, and quality of this existence lays in our own hands. I'm going to have to take my jacket off.
You can take your jacket. It is a very warm...
Melting in front of you.
Well, thank you so much, Tony. And Tony said he will take questions. Thanks so much for such an expansive lecture, which I think sort of balances this very personal encounter with Moore's work as you are becoming a sculptor yourself, and this sort of encounter with both the idea of Moore, this establishment, your somewhat controversial figure, but then this other encounter which you staged, the encounter with his work, going into the gallery in Canada and looking at it again. And I wanted to ask you, is that sort of two different Moores that, you know, when you look at his actual work and his sculpture, all that other, all those other things about him as this establishment figure fade away, and you have this other kind of meeting, this other kind of conversation with his form and the formal languages that he developed throughout his career?
Yes, I think that, yes, there is that aspect that he was this establishment figure. That's definitely true. But also, I mean, what I've tried to describe is the fact that when I went to art school and became interested in sculpture, there was the dialogue, the critical conversations of the time were between metal welding sculptors and people that were basically had another idea of the material world and getting meaning out of the material world. And that was a very hard and quite abusive discussion. I remember myself at one point in Wimbledon when I realized I was more interested in making things. I was on a painting course. And so I went, they just said to me, Tony, you're taking up too much space. And I was like, oh, really? And the dust is ruining everybody else's paintings. So I said, so what? Yeah. Anyway, so they sent me down to the sculpture department, and there were a couple of metal welding sculptors down there, and they took a look at my work, and they would just say, you know, I mean, Cragg, whatever you think it is, it's not sculpture. Go back to where you came from. And so it was really, and that was, I mean, to me personally, I was 20 years old or something. It was like, oh, wow, and it was almost an insight into the vehemence and quite brutality of this conflict. And later on, as I said, I then had friends, Martins, and became more aware of the real background. So Moore was, as I've just said, he was a part of that thing, but he was very distant. He wasn't really relevant to the discussion of the time. And I needed, or whatever. I mean, I had that very singular experience of being in this enormous big concrete hall. It's not a very good piece of architecture, but it absolutely knocks you out, because it's one of the most fantastic things of sculpture anywhere in the world. Yeah.
And is there something about sculpture that is particularly generative of debate? Because all throughout your talk as well, you sort of brought up this idea of sculpture prompting these very fierce, often sometimes violent discussions. And is there something in sculpture?
Well, look, if any change of form, even, you know, stick my tongue out, there's not much material there, but changes your mind, and it changes your, what's this strange person doing? But I mean, there's nothing we're doing. We're looking at each other, reading the change of face, and we know how sensitive we are to reading form. That is the source of language. That is all terms and all words, everything we have in our head has come from our experiences. We're born with also a small developing brain, but we, through our eyes and ears, we absorb the material world around us to build terms, which is the basis of language and our thought. So it's not surprising that you can actually, that sculpture isn't just about objet d'art. It's not just about the object, is it? It's not about the three-dimension extension. It is also about those terms, and that's what in the basis basically makes the sort of the move that Duchamp made of relevance, you know, and the strange thing is that to say this, I mean, Duchamp, there's a lot of talk going on, you know, not so much action, a lot of talk, and it is about words. And for many decades, into the, as I've said, into the, especially after the Second World War, the principles of this this nomination of materials and objects was the prime way of operating for many, many art movements. And but over the course, and even in the time where I've been studying in the 70s, it became absurd to see another ready-made. I mean, if you get into a museum, you see another BMW motorbike exhibited as a sculpture. You think it's so boring, and you realize that démarche, that whole principle of like marching through the world and taking out of the non-art world, bringing things into the art world, and changing that context and giving them different meaning, that it, at some point in a finite world, it runs out of possibilities. There are very, very few things, and I think consequently, I mean, we have Damien Hirst. I mean, I think Damien Hirst, whatever one thinks of his work, does make a very interesting point. He gets to it's getting to the end of the vocabulary, of the inventory of things we can bring into art. So he brings in nature into the museum and into the gallery, and his problems are conservation, presentation, those other problems occur, and I think that's quite a valid way to look at it. So I don't actually see, I mean, I've still, artists are so nice to each other, and they say, and you just wonder sometimes. I'm quite an active person. I really want to have my work seen and whatever, but one must realize that any artist making his work, he does something or she does something which is entirely their own. It's very difficult to compare them, I think, in some way. And it's in the same way, it's quite difficult to compare movements, because where we are now in sculpture, suddenly making things starts to supersede. It comes back into, indeed, with a new vocabulary and a much wider range of possibilities and content. But you see it growing in my work anyway, decidedly, but in many, many other people's works, it's coming back to be relevant, So.
Excellent discussion.
For a fascinating lecture, you used the word anthropomorphic, and I wondered if you could expand on that, and you talked about the human in the landscape, and what are the possibilities for that today, in your opinion, for sculpture being anthropomorphic or seeing the human?
Well, I think that, as I've just said, I mean, we bring a sharpness and a degree of perception to looking at each other that we don't to looking at everything around us. We do select very sharply what we're going to look at. So looking at people's faces and reading people's faces, this is if you like, it's a surface, an information surface. And the same accounts, obviously, to the body, to every pose we take, every gesture you're doing. This is all part, we are signaling all the time. So we don't have to think about that. That is just part of so there's nothing more interesting than the human body. We all have one. So that's the main theme. That's going to always be the case. The problem is that in the traditional sense of the 19th century, where one is representing the figure, that it became very repetitive, because it is an illusion to think you can actually represent the figure. And by the time Moore was making his work, he had that. It's nothing, not detracting from his work, but he did have a sequence of sculptors working towards getting away from an anatomical realism. And I think that was, he didn't even have to think about that anymore. But of course, that's going to always be a theme. The human figure is always going to be a theme. In my own work, and I think now I have to get this back to look at when I'm looking at Moore's, is not actually, I don't, in a serious sense, it's not in a pure sense, it's not actually a representation of the figure. When I use parts of recognizable parts like profiles or bodies or whatever, what I think that is it's a reflection of the fact that everything is there only because we see it. The human intelligence and human perception is a dimension. Things exist somewhere, everywhere, within 3 or 4, how many dimensions you've got. But actually, our seeing is what makes them there in a sense. And so we are, with our perception, we see in the material a reflection of ourselves. So yes, I think that's what it is. The figuration is that is there today, and in my work, and I think in some ways Moore's work is a kind of the presence of a human being in its own perceptions, you know. So, and the problem with making the figure outdoors is another one, because you know, I don't. The things sculpture outdoors is very limited, because I mean you can make sculptures out of biscuits and chocolate and anything you want to make it out of, if it's indoors. But once you go outside, then the range of materials that you can actually use outside are very limited. You know, and bronze is remarkably, you know, that more. I always say this, but I mean bronze is. Everybody thinks there's something special about bronze. There's nothing special. What is special about it? Not the aesthetic qualities of it. It's just that when it's melted at a relatively low temperature, 950 degrees or something, it is more fluid than water. So when it pours into the mold, you can make fantastically polymorphic forms. So that's that. When you get outside, there's a tendency in contemporary art to put the figure outside, and it really looks like territorial marcation. It looks like somebody called me up a few months ago and said, "Oh, I just put up a fantastic work at the bottom of Norway's biggest waterfall," so you can guess who it is. And I thought, well, he's, yeah, you know, 200,000 people are seeing it every year, and I think, yeah, but they were anyway. They were. I don't know what the statistics are for before and after, but I mean that it's a weird idea. So, but I mean that's a little bit unfair. But I think there is a problem marking. You know, just using the figure, because we mark it. Going back to the figure is, if we look at the clouds and the bushes and everything else, we have something in our minds that we see faces. And it's that kind of reflection, the reflection of humanity in the material, that I think is still there and is subtle and interesting.
Yes, I wanted to hear your thoughts on how Moore and also you structure, organise, generate and sculpture across family forms, family groups. More as we know, once you've reclined figures, family groups, you also seem to create these family lineages of form types that have family descendances, sometimes anecdotal. Can you talk a little bit about what decorations like that, about how Moore does that, and any lessons you might have learned from him?
Yeah, I don't really think I've learned very much from Moore. I mean, I have to say that, because I've already started my work. It's not, you know, I'm not, my work's not based on looking at art history. I've never looked at an artwork and thought, oh, you know, oh, that could make that. My mind's really just being in the studio and being surprised that the material lets me do that to it. You know, so that's a very different attitude to having the form that I'm fighting. I never am fighting with. The material is always leading me, I think. And in that way, I can understand. So I think they're two very different things. I mean, what I notice in my own work is that just making a single work, I make it and continue with it, and looking for moments where it becomes interesting. You know, I think there's something you can say. I mean, that I say this regularly, but if you actually have a piece of clay, a big lump of clay, if you're good enough, if you were God, you could make anything out of it. You could make a myriad. You could make infinite number of forms. God made us out of clay, so why wouldn't we be able to? You'd be able to make anything out of it. So the artist's work is not to then what he can make. It is to decide what he has to make. He has to find relevant and meaningful form in the material. Because given endless, an artist just producing every single possibility of everything would be an absurd and crazy waste of time, and it would mean nothing. And so what the artist is doing is trying to find moments. I don't want to teach anybody German today, but I mean, there is a very good German word for this. They talk about poetry. It's called Dichtung. And Dichtung is like putting concentrating terms. So you have a concentration of meaning coming about something, what one could call maybe significance in English. You know, where the signs are thicker they're more important maybe in the corner here than they are out on this big wide surface of where things don't mean very much. So in my own work, when I actually do manage to finish a work, I'm aware what I've really got in my mind is that experience. When I go home and the next day, start the next work, that's the experience that's foremost in my mind. What I could have done, what I should have done, what I learned from the last work, and so to continue like that. So, I can't imagine it would be much different for Moore. That he would have just done the same thing. Every work you make, you've seen what is sculptural development anyway, if it's not that, you know. Say. Sorry.
Thank you. One of the things that keeps on ringing around my head is your, dare I say it, beautiful evocation of sculpture being able to remind us of our own humanity. And you talked about it with Moore, and then that moment in Canada of seeing Moore's work again. And I'm really fascinated by the way you talked about being blind to Moore because he became a representative of the establishment.
Mm.
Now, you just mentioned in your response to John that you haven't necessarily taken anything from Moore, but I wonder if you have thought about that yourself, that as you, I wouldn't say become the establishment, but as you become absolutely at the core of how we think about sculpture, how you can manage to circumvent that blindness about a lodestone thinking about sculpture.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I think I don't know if it's an advantage, but Moore taught for a long time and I taught for many years in academies. So I've had, you know, when I'm talking about my students' work and I'm telling how, you know, I had an experience when I had very good teachers when I was in Britain, and I also had bad experiences of going to St. Martin's and listening to the way they sort of ground the people up and sort of were very, very abusive, you know. Boys and girls sitting there crying because they were told this is shit, you know. I mean, so when I started my life teaching young people to what I thought would be useful for them, I tried to be respectful. All the same, to be any use to them, at some point you have to tell it quite honestly, this is no good. You have to go at it a different way, or just do something else, or whatever, you know. And so it happens on a regular basis that some, well, you make crap anyway, you know. So it's sort of, they're not, students are not, yeah, no, I mean, they're not, they don't, unfortunately, I mean, they're not shy about voicing their opinion. So it doesn't mean that I'm absolutely impervious to people being abusive to me, but it does mean, I know that there are people that are not interested in me and my work just because I'm Tony Cragg, and you know this is this thing, and it's on the art market, and so you have all those things and whatever. Yes, that's it. And of course there are I'm 68, so I mean behind me there are sort of generations of young people and they've gone through all the media and everything else they've ever done. You know, totally different ways of doing things. And of course, but I enjoy it at times when people that have thought, oh, Cragg, you know, and they come around, they say, oh, you know, in front of the work, there's something to be seen and to be thought about. And so that happens as well, but in the end, you can't think about it too much, because that's the basis of making art. You just don't ever give anybody what they want. You have to do what you want to do. You have to, and that's... what I really recognize in Moore is his absolute obsessive personality that really didn't give a damn about, you know, because he was so strong-willed and so energetic in his own, he was a force of nature. And if you don't, as a sculptor, if you don't have that idea of yourself as being a force of nature, then you end up just fiddling around with stuff.
Quick question. You talk in great detail about subsequent generations of sculptors and how they related to Moore in the UK. You spent several decades of working in Germany, and and I just wonder the ubiquity of more that every man in the street experienced in this country wouldn't have applied in other countries. I just wonder how artists saw themselves, if they saw themselves in relation to Moore's work. Yeah,
they do, very much so. I live in Wuppertal. The town of Wuppertal bought a Henry Moore sculpture in 1956. And if you go to Bochum, which is 10 miles away, there's another Henry Moore sculpture. And there's not, in fact, there's hardly a town in that area, God yeah, that doesn't have a few, you know. I mean, the man was really productive. Much more significance when I was in Kansas City and I was in the Nelson Atkins Museum admiring this room of 58 sculptures they have. And they said, oh, Tony, you know, that's nothing. You should go down to the City Museum. They got 120. And I just think, well, what did he do? You know, I mean, I work day and night, but he was really active. I mean, it's a great thing about Moore is that, I mean, he'd been this war artist, whatever, you know, but he was one of the first people to go to Germany and work and take a connection. I mean, Europe and Germany, I think, I mean, I live there and I know in Britain that sometimes there are different ideas about Germany, but Germany is a country that really, after the Second World War, where the artists really had the chance to influence the shape of the society, and they really did. I mean, in a city like Duesseldorf, which is where I'm going to say it's been a major part of my life. I mean, people accumulated there, and I mean, there was an artist not very well known in this country that made things. They tried to avoid the figure because any German figuration looked very pathetic and full of pathos. And Norbert Kricke, for example, was one of the first minimalists because he made wiry, energetic, spatial forms, and it's a very clever thing because he really wanted to avoid. He was left with making the space where the figure could be, but he couldn't make the figure, and so. Norbert Kricke was a great admirer of Henry Moore, and a lot of artists. I know Joseph Beuys was a big fan of, and we had this fantastic experience which he had of putting. I was allowed to exhibit Henry Moore's plaster sculptures in the sculpture park in Wuppertal, and it was one of the most beautiful exhibitions that we've done, and it was because of my relationship, as I said, to the plasterworks, and people came, and they were absolutely knocked out. You couldn't, and the great thing about Moore is, you know, when you have all these contemporary things where, you know, they fill up the great hall in the Tate Gallery with God knows what, anyway. And then, you know, I've said to Nick Sorotis every time, just to do a sort of Madara Rosso's exhibition in the Great Hall, and people would actually have to stop and look at something rather than go, oh well, yeah, there's, you know, put a nasty smell in the room would be my solution. Anyway, so artists came like Thomas Schutter and many artists just came out and they said fantastic. They were totally knocked out by Moore, you know, and so yeah.
Well, I think we should carry on our conversation over a refreshing glass of wine on a very warm Friday evening. Before we do, just to say a few thanks. I want to thank Hannah Hyam and John Wood, who've been our collaborators on programming this evening and tomorrow, where we will continue many of these ideas that Tony has generated for us. So I know many of you are joining us at Perry Green. So do ask us any questions over a glass of wine, logistical, intellectual, and also I'm sure Tony will, if you didn't get to ask a question, to share with you more ideas. But thank you so much, Tony, for setting us off in such a generous and generative way to think about Moore in so many different contexts tonight. So please join with me in thanking Tony.
Thank you. Thank you, Mom.